I'm Rob Bell, an engineer with a thirst for understanding how things work. Join me on a journey to investigate the incredible structures that have stood the test of time and their ground during what was to become a global war. (1940), following the fall of France and the devastating defeat at Dunkirk, Britain stood alone against the onslaught of the unstoppable Nazi menace. With her back against walls not yet built, construction began on an epic project, transforming this green and pleasant land into an impregnable island fortress.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Churchill's rousing speech of defiance laid out the plan for Britain's defence. Each week, I'll be exploring the streets, hills, and landscape he spoke of to uncover the monumental, mysterious, and heroic buildings that helped us win the war. Today, nearly 80 years later, thousands of seemingly random structures still litter our countryside. In many cases, they're just blocks of concrete you might see during a daily commute or pass by on a weekend walk. But if you know what you're looking at, behind these remnants of bricks and mortar, there's a much darker story to be told. It's a tale of terror and fear. At a time when fascism overran the rest of Europe, Britain stood alone. Today, often all that's left to remind us of those dark days are these crumbling remains. But in their day, they were the buildings that fought Hitler. I'm on the south coast of England to seek out the buildings on and around our beaches, the very ones Winston Churchill urged us to fight on if we had to. As an island nation rich in resources and commanding a strategic position, Britain had always been a target for foreign invasion. There were the Romans, the Saxons, and the Vikings, but the successful conquest by the Normans in 1066 was the last. Since then, many had tried. There was the Spanish Armada and Napoleon, but Britain held firm. A combination of naval strength, geographic location, and the good old British weather kept our shores safe from foreign invasion for nearly 1,000 years. But by 1940, everything had changed. Adolf Hitler had smashed Germany's democratic institutions, transforming his country into a war state, and one intent on conquering the whole of Europe.
What one has to understand is that Germany is set up, and always has been set up, and Prussia, before it became Germany in 1871, was because it's so resource poor, because it doesn't have access to the world's oceans, because it's right in the heart of continental Europe, it has to win its wars completely and very quickly, because the moment it gets caught up in a long, drawn-out attritional war, it's going to lose, because it's going to lose that battle of resources. And so, in the summer of 1940, it is imperative that Nazi Germany doesn't just beat Scandinavian countries, Norway and Denmark, and the Low Countries of Holland and Belgium, and the giant, the superpower of France, but also Great Britain. Anything other than complete defeat of Great Britain or coming to the peace table with Great Britain will not be enough.
Germany sought to defeat its opponents in a brutal campaign across Europe. For more than 2 years, they relied on a terrifying and new military tactic.
Blitzkrieg comes from two German words. Blitz, that means lightning, Krieg, which means war. And that is exactly what Hitler wanted when he launched the Blitzkrieg in the battle for France, the opening gambit on the 10th of May, 1940. This was the first time that Hitler had really unleashed a full mechanized attack combined with parachute troops, aerial attack. It was all out. It was well-trained troops, doggedly determined troops, fired up, ready for action. The British Army, the Allies as a whole, were knocked immediately onto the back heel, and within days, they are in a fighting retreat.
Dunkirk and the evacuation of over 338,000 men was followed swiftly by the fall of France.
I think there's something about the British psyche that felt that it was different to continental Europe. So what happened in France was obviously dreadful for the French, but I think there was a sense that Britain would be able to survive this. There was definitely a sense of fear and concern. Dunkirk was a huge shock. Great loss of life and loss of vehicles and ammunition. But I think there was a kind of a coming together. There was a sense of everybody pulling together to be able to defeat the Nazis.
Across the English Channel, Hitler's determined army gathered pace.
I think for Hitler, he's got very few options. I think that once he's committed to invading all these countries, he better just do the lot. And I don't think that he would have felt particularly relaxed about leaving Britain, you know, simply sitting on the edge of Europe with her mighty empire to back her up. So I think that he would have been very nervous about that. So I think in some ways, he's got to finish the job. He's done France, he's got to look across the channel and he's got to go, I've got to do that one too.
Geographically, a full-blown invasion was only realistically possible in southeast England. But blitzkrieg tactics across mainland Europe had proven that everywhere was potentially vulnerable, from parachutists to port attacks, or even subversion through terror. Everything had to be considered. But the first step was to secure our beaches. And as a result, perhaps the easiest place to see evidence of the buildings that fought Hitler is along Britain's shoreline. From small slabs of decaying concrete to domineering but derelict fortresses.
The waters these historic buildings guarded were our first line of defence. Braced for a German onslaught, Britain raced to defend the closest parts to the enemy. They filled the English Channel with a network of mines.
Any enemy ships making for our shores must first penetrate these minefields. The mines are laid by ships specially built or adapted for mine laying. Hundreds of them can be dropped in a short time.
If any vessel made contact with one of these 300-pound explosives, the metal horns, if broken, would release acid, causing it to detonate. But it wasn't just open waters that needed protecting. Essex, and one of only 2 mine control towers of its kind that survives today. During World War II, the Royal Navy sought to make the River Crouch inaccessible to enemy craft. This 2-storey hexagonal mine control tower, with concrete and brick walls over ½ metre thick, reaches skywards 10 metres high.
This would be at a kind of sort of estuary entrance, and what you'd have is you'd have a kind of a sort of boom defence, and you'd have mines there, and this would be able to control that defensive position with wires and things and being able to pull it forward and back. Because obviously you still want to be able to access that estuary yourself and get your own shipping in and out safely, but when the enemy are coming, you want to put it up so that they can't get in. So it needs to be a kind of sort of flexible defence, and the mine control tower just enables you to control that.
Its 6 sides gave a 360-degree defensive capability, with firing slots for a total of 17 machine guns at 2 different heights. This was a truly impressive defence structure, both for gunfire capability and detonation. The mastermind behind the mine tower and the overall strategy for Britain's impenetrable coastal defences was one unique individual.
William Edmund Ironside, known to most of his pals as Tiny. He was 6'4", he was 17 stone. He was a very, very impressive man. He was Royal Military Academy, Woolwich. He'd had a public school background. And with the fall of France, the entire responsibility for the defence of Britain falls on the shoulders of Tiny Ironside. He is a man of his time. A man who had served in the First World War, had been familiar with trench warfare, a man that was used to getting his hands dirty dealing with the sidelights. But to deal with such a huge undertaking as the defence of Britain, he's calling on some very old methods.
Over 100 emergency gun batteries were built along Britain's rugged coastline. Constructed from local materials, it wasn't unusual for beach pebbles and even metal bed springs to be part of their construction. The pebbles, set into the concrete while still wet, provided vital camouflage on an exposed pebble beach. Some just had web netting or irregular-shaped roofs to disguise their outline.
Ironside had begins a combination that became known as the coastal crust. Now, this included scaffolding. So if you can imagine scaffolding with an upright, got a crossbar, and there's rows of this stuff that makes quite a formidable anti-landing craft obstacle. And they've got Danet concertina wire obstacles there. So when you see the photographs of the big reels of wire, then you combine that with a minefield or two as well. So it's all interspersed along making that coastal crust. Then you get a little bit further in on the tops of the cliffs. That's where you're going to have coastal batteries and pillboxes, and some areas even had anti-tank ditches dug around them. So if they did manage to get ashore, instantly that they get into land, and you go into the ditch.
Coastal defences of all types were built at speed as Tiny Ironside's defence plan took shape. Several mine towers and over 150,000 defence mines were laid out in coastal waters, backed up by the buildings on the coastal crust.
Britain had always relied on the natural barrier of the sea and the power of its Royal Navy to stop any major invasion. But with the serious threat of an amphibious assault looming, it soon became obvious that that wouldn't be enough to keep our shores safe. In 1940, the Nazis seemed unstoppable. Well equipped for a land-based war on continental Europe, their heavy investment in mechanised technology and having one of the best air forces in the world had produced lightning results. But they weren't an amphibious army. And if they were going to mount a successful invasion of Britain, they'd have to make their sea crossing as short as possible. And that meant targeting our coastline closest to northern France.
The most accessible shores ran from Lyme Regis in the west all the way to the Kent coast in the east. And with France now conquered, Hitler targeted these areas across the Channel for an amphibious assault.
Operation Sealion was the German code name for the invasion of Britain. There was a hope that they would be able to sue for peace, but with Churchill becoming increasingly belligerent in his speeches, he kind of pushed Hitler into demanding the invasion of Britain. Hitler wanted to mobilise the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, and also the Wehrmacht, the army. So coordinating these huge armed forces to target Britain.
I think when you look at Sealion as an operation, as this whole thing, you've got to put together barges, the Navy to support the barges. You've got to have the Air Force covering this army going over the water. This is an immensely difficult logistical operation, and you only have to spool forward 4 years to D-Day to realise how complicated it is to get an armada, a modern armada, across, at its narrowest point, 20-odd miles of British Channel. At the same time, the British have got to take it seriously. I mean, it's not a Boy Scouts, it's not the Hitler Youth coming over, it's still, the German Navy, the German Air Force, the German Army. It can hurt you, so you've got to defend yourself.
By the end of July, the Royal Navy was pulling its larger warships out of the Channel due to the threat from German aircraft. Undeterred, the man in charge of defences, General Tiny Ironside, fought on. Many of Britain's historic buildings along our seacoast were re-established, ready to do battle with Germany.
There's a whole load of defences that were built in the Napoleonic era, particularly off the south coast of South Sea and Portsmouth and Southampton, around there, around the Isle of Wight. They were used and turned into gun positions. There were other earlier Victorian gun emplacements. I mean, protecting the Falmouth estuary in Cornwall, for example. There was a huge great gun position that was manned during the Second World War. I mean, if you've already got those places, you might as well use them. Famously also, of course, there was the defences at Dover Castle and tunnels that would already been built into the cliffs during the Napoleonic era. It widened and expanded and used as a kind of naval control rooms and operations rooms at Dover. So quite a lot were used and adapted.
Besides being utilised as command centres, many of the South Coast's existing historic bases were pressed back into active service. This is New Haven Fort. It was completed in 1871 and designed to protect the vital harbour below it.
Designed by 22-year-old Lieutenant John Charles Ardagh of the Royal Engineers and built by the Victorians, it took 10 years and 6 million bricks to complete. Built into the contours of the land, it lay protected on 2 sides by a deep, wide moat, and on the other 2 sides by a towering cliff. But to defend it against Hitler's army, it still needed reinforcing and more powerful weapons.
One very World War II feature to the fort's main entrance, above the lovely Victorian archway as you come in, there's a pillbox on the top. The fort had several pillboxes added around. Other defences that were quickly put in. 2 anti-aircraft guns arrived at the fort. I believe they were Bofors guns, the quick-firing ones. And where the car park is, a large concrete emplacement was put up there for a field gun aiming towards the beach.
One significant change was coastal radar. Built just outside the fort, it was linked to a large underground naval communication centre, as gunboats, minesweepers and RAF Sea Rescue utilised the harbour. Despite the upgrade, many of the fort's guns still dated back to the First World War. But just one of these heavy fixed weapons equalled 3 out at sea. The steadiness on land and greater range gained from a high coastal position made the strike rate second to none.
Although some of the guns in these coastal batteries might have been a bit outdated, fire control technology had moved on. Radar helped, along with an improved visual spotting of targets and more efficient gun laying. And feedback from action against sea targets through registering the echo from shot fallout meant that even 15 miles out at sea, enemy ships could be engaged with a steady concentration of accurate fire.
80 years after the last gun blast, this magnificent fort and its weapons is undergoing a 10-year maintenance and management programme to ensure its survival.
With the Victorian structures, you can tell they've taken a lot more time, care and attention into the finish and the detail of the structures. Just from looking around, you can see the red brickwork, finishing details. You've got solid brick-built walls as well throughout. They're standing the test of time, apart from a few minor surface areas predominantly, but the structure is pretty much sound. When you look at the World War II defences, they're The walls were a lot thinner, there's a lot more concrete around than there would have been before. It would have been a lot quicker to build, and it's faring a lot worse than the Victorian structures. The radar centre in particular is placed on a very precarious location on the edge of a cliff. There's very severe cracks in the walls. A lot of pigeons are nesting on it, you can see from afar. The challenge more is not that it's World War II in trying to maintain it, it's more the coastal location of the site. A lot of it is buried under the cliff face, so you have a lot of soil and vegetation above, which creates a lot of moisture coming down through the building. My favourite part of the fort is one of the counterscarp galleries. You have to go up a stone staircase and into a completely blacked out area of the building. It's pitch black, and it used to be a defensive point for the moat. Soldiers would stand and shoot out, and then cannons would be below. Just history coming alive really before your eyes.
These hulking historic forts were all well and good, but by 1940 they'd clearly outlived their original purpose. Even with modifications, there were two glaring military and strategic issues that couldn't be avoided. Firstly, they were not built to withstand attack from the air. And secondly, what if the invasion came somewhere else? Somewhere beyond the range of their, albeit massive, guns?
I'm on the south coast of England, delving into the stories and heroic structures scattered along our shoreline. From being bowled over by an imposing mine tower to being intrigued by the noblest of forts, it's often the simplest of defence structures that pack the greatest punch.
Historically, our coastal defences were established to protect our main ports. They were well built and heavily armed. But rapid developments in tactics and technology meant that vast swathes of a potentially 400-mile-long coastline that had previously had no intrinsic strategic value now needed defending from possible invasion.
In Britain, there wasn't enough heavy guns. And so with every week that passed, every month that passed, so that situation improved because the British Army was so small in 1939, the first part of 1940. Deliberately so. You know, we did naval power, Britain does air power, burgeoning air power, but the army bit, that was going to be left to Britain's ally France. Then France collapses and suddenly it's like, oh, well, that part of the plan didn't work then. So what are we going to do? So you have to suddenly mobilise, but you can't just click your fingers and produce vast numbers of kind of high-velocity anti-tank guns or tanks or artillery pieces. It takes time. But with every passing week, with every passing month, so those numbers increase. So the longer the Germans take to actually launch an invasion, the better the British situation becomes. Really, the key to it is, could the British Army, and together with the Home Guard, could they have coordinated themselves quickly enough and swiftly enough with what they had?
What Britain had was the threat of the Luftwaffe and an urgent need to protect its civilians from air raids. But if our buildings were to stand strong in the face of the enemy, they couldn't do it alone. There were lessons to be learned from our allies.
I think you've got to remember that communications within the French armed forces were absolutely parlous. I mean, the chief of staff doesn't have a telephone, so how's anything going to get transmitted to anybody? And so you have a lot of French soldiers and equipment just sitting idle, doing nothing, and just basically saying to the Germans, in you come.
Whole cities in France were demolished during the Second World War. 1.5 million buildings destroyed by bombs. Britain's defence structures needed to be fortified and make use of the latest technology.
What they wanted to do was be able to use radio waves to detect the approach of enemy aircraft. And the trouble was, the stations that are set up around Great Britain could detect aircraft coming over the channel, but you couldn't always rely on it. Particularly with the Focke-Wulf 190s, they could fly very, very low beneath the beam and then make landfall. And that's why we had terror all along our coastline.
If the Luftwaffe were successful, 400 miles of open shores provided the perfect landing site for German flotilla and troops. Swift action was needed to prepare against a combined operations assault.
So unlike many established coastal batteries like this, across some of Britain's more vulnerable and desolate shores, a rapid building program began. The aim was to create a string of powerful new defences capable of repelling the enemy both at sea and on the beaches. But most importantly, also resilient to attack from the air.
On the coast of Lincolnshire, one of the finest examples of defence buildings still standing is Freeston Shore. World War II enthusiast Paul Britchford runs the local Home Guard Museum. His friend Ted Warmley has lived here since childhood.
We was always up here, playing up here and doing other things we shouldn't do, which we'll tell you up there. When we came here, the soldiers had gone. They disappeared for D-Day. Everything was there just as I left it, but the guns had gone, of course.
This was a World War II coastal defence battery during the war. We're standing next to the searchlight position. Got fantastic views out to sea.
Built from brick and concrete, on a flattened landscape, the Freeston Shore defences were easily visible to enemy planes. To protect them from aerial attack, they needed to be heavily disguised.
The Germans would have been looking for any defensive positions to take photographs of. And they came up with the idea of disguising it as a sweet shop.
They were all slated on the roof with sweets, cigarettes and chocolates on board around the outside to make the Germans think there were shops.
The Freeston defences may have looked harmless to the enemy, but its role was highly strategic.
The importance of this site was the docks. Just off to our right is Boston Docks. That would have been a target for any invasion army, but the Germans would have loved to have taken over Boston Docks, obviously to unload troops, ammunition, and once they'd got a foothold there, they could have swept inland, basically taken over Lincolnshire and then spread.
As a fairly new addition to the coastal crust defence, volunteers were called upon to help man the site.
So when the war broke out, there were lots of calls for a home guard to be formed. So Churchill was a key proponent of this. And within 24 hours, over 250,000 men had reported at their police stations. So there is this kind of enthusiasm for wanting to do their bit. They're having to go into anti-aircraft batteries, operating the searchlights, so the big beams to illuminate German aircraft, and then the anti-aircraft battery is what is releasing the weapons to try and shoot them down.
And getting to grips with these new roles meant a lot of trial and error.
There was 2 big guns up there, like 6-inch First World War guns, naval guns, but they never had to use them, but they did fire them off, trying them out. They were warned where to point them to, because if they pointed them the wrong way, they would take the plumbers' windows out, which plummeted the hotel up there. So they forgot what they'd been told, and they fired it over that way, and out went the plumbers' windows.
So they're looking for a lot of glaziers, weren't they, at the time, to put all the windows back in?
Yeah.
While this gun station aimed at the beach, another more remote outpost had its weapons pointing skywards.
This is the anti-aircraft station. You would have had one soldier, loneliest job in the world, stood with a Lewis gun if they were attacked from the air. Not a good place to be. As you can see, it's quite vulnerable. There was probably a couple of platoons worth of soldiers here at any given time. It was the Queen's Own Royal Artillery, and also the local Home Guard were used in this area for training alongside the regular troops. So very important site.
some of these people were incredibly proficient soldiers, and you would not have necessarily, if you're an invading, German infantryman, want to find yourself against, a group of 30, 40-year-old men defending their homeland, because of course their motivation was incredibly strong. You're defending your home.
These fortified constructions gave the soldiers shelter and protection to stand their ground. And all these years later, it's still something of a safe haven.
This is the main gun battery at Freeston Shore. These guns would have been looking straight out to sea. This is now an RSPB nature reserve, all this. But during World War II, this would have been your last line of defence on the coast. These were 6-inch naval guns, so battleship guns basically, from World War I. These guns could fire nearly 8 miles out to sea, so you can imagine the size of them. This is the soldiers' rest station, if you like. This is where the soldiers would be manning the guns. At the end of their shift, they would come down here. You can see we've got a fireplace. These are the most uncomfortable beds in the world, made of concrete. You'd have had 2 soldiers on the top and the tail in, 2 underneath. Not the most comfortable of place to be, but at least it was somewhere out of the wind and out of the weather. Some of the graffiti on the wall is actually wartime dated, 1941, 1942, soldiers have signed it. There's an interesting picture on the wall of a Messerschmitt. And if you follow my finger, you can see the cockpit of the aeroplane there. And it comes back towards the tail. And then you've got the German cross in the middle, and there's the wing. That is a Messerschmitt 109, you can tell by the design of it. We think that this has been drawn on here to outline what the soldiers need to be shooting at if one of these flies over. So it's like a bit of aircraft recognition.
Identifying enemy planes against a night sky was challenging, so silhouette charts helped the uninitiated distinguish between friend or foe. Had the Germans got past our outer defences, then plans were afoot for coastal villages to take up the fight.
Areas like Weybourne in Norfolk, the village was evacuated, and the whole area was going to become scorched earth. The idea being that the Royal Air Force could come in with heavy-duty incendiary devices, oil bombs, and turn the whole lot into a flaming barrage against the men on land. And we mustn't forget that both sides in World War II had developed bacterial weapons and, of course, poison gas, just like in the First World War. It wasn't used, but we had the stocks. And Churchill, he said, if this is going to be landings, if there's nothing else we can do, we'll launch the poison gas to defend our beaches. We'll fight them on the beaches.
With our historic harbours and port defences being steadily updated, and the newly created temporary coastal batteries like Freeston plugging the gaps, General Tiny Ironside's coastal crust was beginning to take shape. The only remaining problem was how to defend the miles of exposed coastline between them.
Towards the end of 1940, Britain's newly upgraded forts and port defences were ready to join the war effort against an amphibious invasion.
Although often poorly manned and dependent on obsolete World War I naval guns dragged out of retirement, there was at least a defensive coastal crust network taking shape.
What remained were the most challenging landmarks, offering easy glider, parachute, or even seaplane access.
But here, the geography of England's south coast lent a helping hand.
The beaches of Britain are being transformed. You know, it's no longer a place of sunbathing and frolics. It's wire, it's mines. You know, every single one of them. There's pillboxes being put up, and there are guards all the way along it. All this beach line, all this coastline is being pretty heavily defended.
I think coastal defences are kind of hardwired into the British psyche, if you like. I mean, you walk along just about any scrap of coastline in Great Britain, and you're going to see some remnant of defence. The whole idea of sort of, you know, building up this kind of boundary between you and the rest of the world is very much hardwired. So I think there's nothing more natural than for the British to do. There's someone nasty on the other side of the channel, start digging.
Which was just as well, as Hitler's intrepid plan for a coastal invasion was imminent.
Operation Sealion, the hope was that the Luftwaffe would clear the skies in 4 days. So Eagle Day was launched on the 13th of August. So by that reckoning, as long as they had good weather, you know, before the end of August is when they should have been thinking about invading.
The more Britain devoted to reinforcing its defence structures, the more enemy combat would be intent on destroying them. And it soon became clear our weak spots weren't the buildings themselves.
Today, this sweeping estuary where the River Cuckmere meets the English Channel is a beautiful and popular tourist location. It attracts 350,000 visitors every year. But 80 years ago, the last thing we wanted coming here was visitors.
Battlefield archaeologist Peter Hibbs works for the Defence of East Sussex project.
Today we're at Cuckmere Haven. As you can see, I've got the Seven Sisters Cliffs just behind me. And in 1940, this was a prime invasion beach for the Germans. It's strategically important to defend this area because we've got a low beach. So this is a prime area for landing craft to pull up and start offloading troops. And we know after the war, when the German Operation Sealion invasion plans for Britain were uncovered, that the Germans were actually planning to land troops here.
It may look like random bits of concrete, but Cuckmere Haven was built to play a pivotal role in combat. Over 20 military structures were positioned to bear the brunt of a German amphibious assault, forming an impressive barricade above the waterline.
We've got an intricate network of defences here. So you can see over my shoulder we have an anti-tank wall that we know they started building in June 1940. You can see they started off building it as a solid wall, but by August the nation is starting to run low on its stocks of cement, and you can see where the design of the wall has turned from solid wall to individual blocks. Down on the beach over there we've got a few anti-tank dragon's teeth that were forming the end of that wall. We've got minefields laid behind it. Back in 1940 we had belts of barbed wire, and the whole area was covered by machine gun fire from several pillboxes.
So there were potentially over 500 of these constructions across Britain, and they would have been mainly built by the Royal Engineers to begin with. And these were, as the name suggests, military engineers. So they're builders and they're plumbers and they're construction workers. And they are devising these pillboxes, which are generally hexagonal buildings with embrasures, which are kind of holes where they could fire out of. And they were dotted across the countryside.
We're in one of the pillboxes, which was part of the network of defences here at Cuckmere Haven in 1940. This pillbox would have been deliberately placed in this position with the embrasure overlooking a particular area of beach, and with the Vickers gun they would have surveyed where the rounds were going to fire. So our pillbox is directly facing similar pillboxes on the other side of the valley, and between them they cover the flat beaches and the anti-tank walls and the barbed wire obstacles. So you're not sniping at individual soldiers, you're shooting probably at a line of them coming across the beach and hoping to catch them in your fire.
The original Vickers gun the pillboxes were first built to accommodate was the weapon of choice. This impressive belt-fed machine gun used 250 rounds at a time. It was capable of a heavy and sustained rate of fire.
At some point in the history of this pillbox, perhaps in late 1940, early 1941, they changed the use of the pillbox to accommodate the Bren gun, which is what we've got here.
The Bren gun, compared to the Vickers, had just 28 rounds in a magazine before it needed reloading. Meanwhile, the Germans were using MG30s, a magazine-fed weapon with a far higher rate of fire. Yet, up and down the coast, pillboxes were still adapted to switch from Vickers to Bren guns.
They've reduced the height of the shelf there. They've put in this concrete block, which, as you can see, accepts the Bren gun tripod instead. And there might have been several reasons that they did this. We're not too sure from the documents. It's possibly to do with the amount of specialist training that a Vickers gun team would need to be able to operate the weapon effectively, whereas every infantry soldier was well trained on the Bren. It also may be to do with the change in the nature of the threat that was perceived against his coastline by that point. Moving into 1941 and 1942, the threat of a full-scale invasion from across the Channel had diminished, and the threat was really now more about small-scale commando raids.
The pillboxes and the guns they housed were hard to defeat. Only artillery, anti-tank weapons and grenades could destroy these robust concrete dugouts.
It would have been very claustrophobic in here. You've got to remember that you've probably got 2 or 3 men in here. You've got a lot of ammunition boxes stacked up. You've got your supplies, your water supply. Obviously, there's no toilet facility here. You may be in here from an evening waiting for the invasion to come overnight or here at dawn. And you're under no illusions as to what your role here is and probably what your fate will be if the invasion comes. The documents state very clearly that there will be no withdrawal from these beach defences. You will stand and fight to the last man and the last round. So if you've got a German flamethrower just coming up the beach, it's not going to be a good day at the office for you.
When Churchill said, "We will fight them on the beaches," he meant it. And it would have all happened here. It would have been a bloody and desperate fight. But had the Nazis made it through, all was not lost. We'd then be fighting them in the fields.